I actually don't like how that smells, it's just good material for the background. Anyway, welcome everybody to another video. Today I want to show you 5 interesting things that I recently discovered while starting a new project. And when I mean starting a new project, this is what I mean here. You can see that this is just a bare bones structure that we started out with in the kick and the bass and some of the main drums here. And the rest of it is all just basic ideas that I've laid down, and none of this is actually final. It usually takes me a little while to get into a nice overarching theme for a track, and that is when really everything starts to fit together. So a lot of the elements that you're going to see today aren't going to go into the final track. But that doesn't mean that there aren't interesting things to talk about, so today that's what we're going to do, starting with interesting fills. And what I mean by that is that there's a few different techniques that I'm employing to keep my fills interesting. So let's just have a listen to a bunch of them. This one is going to go really nice with the build-up effect that we're going to have over here that I'm going to cover later. And then we have a fill where a sound is nicely coming in. And then we have this final fill over here where also a lot of interesting things are happening. So you might be able to hear that this project is heavily inspired by an artist called Electric Universe. I really like what he does in his productions in that it has both this kind of very complex and very glued together and almost everything kind of morphing into each other kind of effect to his tracks. But also there's a lot of parts of the production where it is really clear that one element plays after the other element and that there's space being carved for certain elements in parts of the tracks. The reason why I say something like that is because it's usually either one or the other, in the sense that if you're gluing everything together and everything is morphing into each other, you don't really have individual spaces for individual elements. But if you have individual spaces for individual elements, everything is going to sound much more disconnected from each other. So the way that I've been thinking about that is really when it comes to stuff like fills, that is where you want to have individual elements that are going to be really distinct. So if we're going to go through here, for example, we can see that in the kick roll, we just have individual kicks here playing and doing their own thing. And there isn't going to be any overlap between the different ideas that I'm doing with my kick fills. Even if we open this up, you can see that one kick definitely stops playing before the next one starts. I've also made sure that with the gate value set low here and the low amount of release that we have on the sampler, that is also going to be the case for this kick roll. And finally, what you'll see is that, you can see this from the waveform really nicely, is that towards the end of the fill, I'm really taking a moment to just lower it a little bit and to give a little bit of extra impact to the next kick that is going to come. This is not always something that you want. If you go to some of the other fills, you can see that that is definitely not the case. So here we can see that we have the fill and it's definitely kind of rising in volume here before we go into the kick. And you can hear that that is much more connected than the other fill was. But every once in a while, having a fill that has a little bit of a pause like that is a great way to get that more staccato feeling where every element feels a little bit more like it's in its own pocket. Because one, as I said, we're really making sure that every element of that kick roll was having its own space. And two, by literally pausing a little bit before you get that feeling of just the track as a whole, having a staccato moment and then going back into the kick drum. Whereas in other parts, for example here with the drum fill that we have here, this guy, together with the main synth that is coming in. Ignore the group that is over here because that's actually turned off. But this main synth over here is actually coming in with a high pass filter, as you can see, and some other automations. But these are actually going to fade into this part over here when the kick is going to start to play. And towards the end of the production, what you can imagine is that I would do is, for example, you can actually see that in this fill. This is a better example. Here we have a crash that is reversing into this part. We have a little slide thing that is reversing into this part. We have kick rolls that are going into this part as well. We have our main drum fill that is going into it and that becomes more and more distorted. Everything is kind of leading up into the kick drum itself, and that gives a lot of power to this moment. That gives a lot of impact to that moment. But what it doesn't do is it doesn't really feel like there's any breathing room between the different segments. So keeping fills interesting really is about having different ideas, different things in different fills. That also means that if you're doing a kick roll in one spot, don't do a kick roll in all of your fills. And if you're doing a drum fill or a synth fill, don't do them in all of your fills. Do different things in different fills depending on what the elements around the fills need and what the transition needs. And honestly, that is one of the main ways that you keep tracks more interesting, is just adding more details in the fills and doing different things and having different ideas in there. Now, rhythm continuation is really what the name suggests. We have this rhythm over here in this part of the drop. In this case, it is 2 plucks, but you can think of it as one element in the sense that the rhythm really is here and here we have something happening, and then there's 4 16 notes in between them. If we go into the next melody that is going to play, as you can see, we have 2 here, 4 16 notes of space, and then we have another thing over here. And you can see that with the clips above it, it just neatly matches up. So this part of the rhythm is essentially a continuation of the elements that we have over here, but it's definitely a different element. So what is essentially happening is that we have 2 elements that are kind of linked in a way, in the sense that part of the groove that they're playing is exactly the same, but by virtue of them having different types of sound design and essentially being different elements in the sense of what they actually do, right? In the sense that this is just little stabs that are playing in very specific spots, and then this is a continuous melody that just happens to have the same groove in those spots where these stabs used to play. You can imagine that there isn't really any direct equality between the two, but it's a little bit more vague how the 2 sounds are equal. But that does mean that it is interesting, but not so different that it doesn't feel like it just is a completely different part of the track and it's just a completely different idea. I do have completely different ideas in this track as well. If you go to this part here, this is a completely different groove and I'm trying to do something completely different here. So this is a melody that's continuing, and then this is going to be a 2-bar repeating pattern kind of idea based on a much more glitchy sound. So you can hear really there is no cohesion between those 2 elements, but if we now play this one over here, you can hear that there's much more cohesion between the main plucks that we hear and the stuff that is going on in the melody part. Now, before this version of the melody was in here, there was a different element in there, which was going to be this element, the one that was previously disabled. I'm just going to sweep that around so that you can hear what it sounded like before. Now, this is also cool elements, don't get me wrong, but it really didn't feel like it fits this part of the track. It is probably going to go into a different part of the track because I do really like what I'm doing here, but it didn't really have the speed what I was looking for. What it does have is the aggression, and that is because of the way that I designed this. The way that this part started out was just with this here. And honestly, even here, I changed the melody after I designed this, so this isn't fully representative of what we were doing here. But this was the main initial idea, and this is really just the processing chain that is doing that. If I turn off the processing chain, you can hear how boring this sound becomes. Of course, it becomes also a lot quieter, but you can hear that the main thing that is giving really the texture of the sound is also it's not just the loudness, it is also the texture for which the effects are responsible. So what I want to go through is the effects themselves and what they're doing. First of all, we have the disperser. This is doing phase dispersion exactly in the spot where the kind of mid-range, where the highest part of the energy of the sound is going to be. And you can hear that that makes it sound a little bit more clicky. And then we have the main guy, which is going to be Isotope Trash 2, in which I designed some distortion, some really heavy distortion. We can see that we have some, what Seamless R likes to call asymmetrical distortion. What that means is that the negative part of the waveform is actually going to be pushed up into the positive part of the waveform. And in this case, we're not doing that for the positive part of the waveform, where we're just applying some like slightly abstract distortion, but it is still like a normal kind of distortion for the positive part of the waveform. The way that you should read this graph is that these are your input values. So this is everything that is the positive cycle of the waveform, and this is everything that is the negative cycle of the waveform. And that is going to be mapped to these output values here. So you can see that this is the positive cycle of the output, and then this is the negative cycle of the output. And that means that, as I said, the negative part is going to be mapped to both the negative part of the waveform in the output as well as to the positive part. And this honestly just creates a really nice warm texture, which I really like. And it's of course also going to be very gritty because the amount, like the distortion that we're doing is actually quite extreme. And then we also just want some loudness. So that is why we have a second stage of distortion in here, which is just making stuff a lot louder. As you can see, this is just like normal, nothing asymmetrical about it, nothing strange about it, but we're just pushing it up into it and just making it a lot louder. Again, you can imagine that very low input volumes are going to be pushed to much higher output volumes here. I'm doing a little bit of EQing on that, but that is really all that I'm doing in Trash 2. At least I believe. Or there is a filter over here. This is just brightening stuff up. And then this should be it. So that is responsible for the actual distortion that we're hearing. And of course, also responsible for a lot of the loudness that we're hearing. And then we have BX Stereo Maker, which is a nice stereo texture, which in this case, I'm actually turning down the amount of stereo that it introduces so it doesn't do too much. But really also it nicely changes the tonality a bit. We have a little bit of EQ to shape that. Saturator to keep the volume under control and to shave off any peaks. And then we have our delay and reverb. So this was already a very cool sound, and just playing it in the track like this is already very interesting. But really what I wanted to capture was a little bit more of the changes that you hear in an Electric Universe track. And especially if you get that part where he is also doing the distorted FME kind of synths, which he is kind of known for. It's really more complex what he is doing. So what I decided to do is, first of all, I just duplicated the patch, and in the patch itself that is generating the actual sound, I just assigned a macro to a bandpass filter. This bandpass filter isn't on the original patch, the other patch that we saw, but this is just adding a little bit of moving tonality to it. And then what I decided to do is I decided to add extra patches that almost act like counter melodies in a way, or counter rhythms. So that are these two guys over here. And you can hear what kind of difference they actually make in a sound like this. In this case, this guy is doing something that is a little bit melodic, so it's giving a little bit of a more melodic sense to the sound. And then here we have a nice addition to the groove, which is just a sliding kind of note that is fairly low. You can see it's mixed lower in volume as well, so it's not going to push the distortion as much as the other sounds. But it's doing that alternating every beat, which is a nice way to add a little bit of that driving feeling into it. And overall, the way that this works and the way that I decided to do this is that because we already had the chain coming from just this sound as a whole, everything else that you hear was designed with this chain in mind. So the sound design, if you just look into some of these things, may not make actual sense in terms of sound design, what we're doing. To be honest, I don't remember because this was made a few days ago. But you might say like, oh, the sound design that you're actually doing in here doesn't really make a lot of sense from this perspective of, oh, you wouldn't make a sound like this if you didn't have this chain on there. But because we have this chain on there, I am coming up with ideas that I otherwise just wouldn't have because it's already doing the processing for me. Now, I like to call this workflow, in this case, because I'm using distortion quite heavily, I like to call this distortion shaping. And there's actually another place where I'm doing that, and that is in this fill over here. I talked about before how it had the distortion kind of coming in, but you're again going to see Isotope Trash over here. And you can see that I have again done some cool custom distortion. In this case, we have an actual one of, I don't know if this is like a preset or if this is like a shape, whatever the right term is. I'm using this hard limits over here, and you can see that it's having a certain result on the actual curve, even though the curve that we are drawing in is actually quite simple. We are therefore getting this kind of distortion where the negatives are again being pushed into the positive areas and the other way around. In this case, it is symmetrical in the sense that what is happening to the positive part is also happening to the negative part. And that is all that I wanted, because in this case, all that I'm really after is a lot of grittiness for it. And the reason for that is because we have the distortion here. What I can then do is I can start to combine different sounds, different individual fills, and together push them into that distortion and get tones out of it that you wouldn't really get if you just have one fill where you're maybe automating a distortion or something like that. Instead, what you're going to get is you're going to get cool sounds that are really the combination of one, layering up these fills, and two, pushing everything into that distortion, but setting up the distortion first and only then going into the sounds that are actually going to push the distortion and that are going to actually make the sounds that come out of the distortion. So the fill now sounds like this. And of course, without the distortion, that is simply just not going to work. It is really just missing the grittiness that I wanted and the kind of sliding feeling that I want going into this next part. I'll also play it without the soloing so you can hear it in context with and without the distortion. That works. It has a nice sliding and carrying feeling into the next part. And in this case, the fill sounds a lot flatter because it doesn't become more aggressive towards the end of the fill. Of course, we still have the filter before it's kind of opening up on it, but that really doesn't do enough for my liking. So having this distortion on here and kind of designing stuff into that is a much more interesting way of doing things, and it can either lead to some interesting sound design ideas or to some nice ideas for the progression of different elements. The next thing that I want to talk about is something that I've been doing more recently in like a few of my projects, but this one is already getting very heavily into it, and that is taking an EQ and either just EQing out different parts with an automation. We can see here we have this automation going up on this guy, which you can see it's just literally going up over time. But there's also going to be other parts. If we scrub through this, you can also see a way that this is coming in. Have a look at what this EQ is doing over here as I scrub through it. It is just slowly opening up both with a high pass filter and with a low pass filter. But notice how the high pass filter is also going up in Q. Right, it starts down here and then towards the end it just goes up in the Q factor. And the reason why I've been doing that is because it is much more interesting automating a few different parameters that combine in interesting ways rather than just having one parameter. I could just say like, okay, I'm going to have a low pass filter. Right now we have the high pass filter. I could just have a low pass filter that over the course of this sound playing is just going to open up like this. But what that means is that the sound is going to get really mid-rate, like lower mids heavy from the start, and only towards the end is the main like musical part of the sound going to come through, the stuff that is sitting in this area over here. You can see the area where it's opening up from. That is really where I want it to open up from, as opposed to having it really strong at say 200 Hertz and nothing happening at 1K yet. Don't get me wrong, there are moments where that can also be useful, but most likely I like to have the sound coming from the middle and kind of opening up both ways. Now this is definitely not the only automations that I'm doing. In fact, there's some very, very interesting things also happening with, for example, the delay and the shifter here, mainly towards the end here, which results into this really cool effect. You can hear that we get these cool lasery down effects, and that is really the shifter acting on what the delay is doing. So we have the delay really opening up towards the end here, and as you can see it goes to 100% dry wet here. So there's going to be a really strong delay happening here, and then throughout this part it is going to slow down, and that is also where the frequency shifter is going down. And all of these automations, all of these different ideas and different things that I'm doing result in a much more interesting sound than just your individual one or two automations that I would normally use on my sounds. Like I've really gotten into just automating a lot more parameters than I would. I don't even think that these are all of the automation on the sound. Let me just quickly try to reset that. yes, there's some more stuff happening even over here. If we go later on in the effects, we can see that for one, we have this shaper box, which is responsible for the tape stop effect that we hear in this part. And then we have this spectral freeze that I'm using. Let me play it like this. So this is another part where I'm going to have a little bit of a pause. I still need to build it in a little bit more so that it's a little bit nicer and it's a little bit more glued into the rest of the elements, so to say. But also here you can see I'm not just freezing this sound, I'm also then using a pitch shifter to actually bend it down again. So if you go into this automation here, you can see that it's slightly bending down over that part. And that should also be here, that's this guy over here. But it's also turning on here. And we have some other things. We have some volume compensation. We have the freeze itself going on. We have this guy going from dry wet 0 all the way up. That is just to control different effects, right? To have it turn on and then turn off again and make sure that it's only contained within that small part of the sound. So really the big takeaway from this section is just automate a lot of different things. If you want cool, interesting transitioning and morphing sounds, automations are the way to go. Now, one of the parameters that are interesting to automate and that I'm also automating in this patch, specifically for the build-up, is going to be the pitch. As you can see, we have a pitch bend happening over here that is just turning up over time. First it goes the first 12 semitones and then it goes the second 12 semitones. And there seems to be a slight bit of an error over here, which I don't want. We just want it to go up to 24 over here. And the reason why in this case I'm using the pitch bend is because we have a build-up and therefore having building elements and having rising elements is really the norm of a build-up. That is what a build-up is supposed to do. But I found that over the last few projects, I've been having a lot more fun with pitch and specifically trying to get away from just continuously playing this sound over and over again in the root note. I've always been more on the melodic side of when it comes to creating sidetrans, but that has always been kind of restricted to, say, a MIDI clip and playing a melody in a MIDI clip, or having, for example, sounds that are like an atmosphere in nature. So for example, this guy over here, if I quickly turn off the effects that we have on there that I'm going to talk about in a bit, then we have something like this. So this is an atmosphere that in and of itself has that little bit of pitch drifting, slightly changing in tonality kind of feel to it. But what I've been doing more, and something that we already heard, is stuff like this, where we just have it shifting upwards. In this case, it is a frequency shifter, but pitch shifter and frequency shifter, they achieve the same thing in that they move stuff around in the frequency spectrum. Of course, the pitch tries to maintain the harmonic separation, whereas the frequency shifter doesn't do that, and you get a much more atonal kind of rising effect. And sometimes, in the case of this guy over here, I'm actually combining the two. We saw that we had the pitch shift over here before going up, but we also have this frequency shift going up over here, which is responsible for part of that laser effect that I mentioned before. But within the context of this track, listen to how many different elements are rising from this part. And this isn't even finished yet, so there's going to be more rising elements in this part to actually make this part of the build-up work. Almost every sound that is playing in this part of the track is rising up here, either through the pitch or through the frequency shifter. And that creates this really nice collective rising effect, which is what makes a good build-up in my opinion. So that is the final thing that I've been doing a lot in these final few projects that I've been writing, is using pitch shifting on many different elements, or frequency shifting on many different elements, or a combination of both on many different elements, and having all of them collectively work to one single build-up, as opposed to just having an element be the main build-up element and then kind of leaving everything else around it untouched, or maybe like fading it out in volume to make space for my main building element. In the last few tracks, I've just made everything part of the rising effect and the building effect of that part of the track. So those are just some tips of the things that I've been doing. Let me know if any of these are something that you already employ. And if you have other tips, of course, leave them in the comments down below. Another way to support the channel is by becoming a Patreon, YouTube member, or Twitch subscriber, which gives you a whole bunch of different benefits, including early access to videos and discount code on my products. So if any of that interests you, make sure to check it out, and thank you if you do. Bye bye.